What if I told you that in 1878, a photographer in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania captured an image that showed a room that didn't exist? And when they tore down a wall 15 years later, they found that exact room, perfectly preserved, with a body inside. Before we dive into this absolutely chilling story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this case was deliberately suppressed by local authorities for decades, and what you're about to hear will change how you think about photography forever. The year was 1878, 15 years after the Battle of Gettysburg had turned the small Pennsylvania town into the bloodiest battlefield in American history. The town was still recovering, still finding bodies in fields, still haunted by what had happened there. Photography was becoming more common, but it was still expensive, still mysterious, still treated with a kind of superstitious respect by ordinary people. Our story begins with a man named Samuel Porter, a 38-year-old photographer who had moved to Gettysburg from Philadelphia to document the aftermath of the war. He specialized in architectural photography, capturing images of damaged buildings, makeshift hospitals, and the homes that had been converted into field stations during those terrible 3 days in July 1863. Samuel had a reputation for meticulous work, for capturing details that other photographers missed. In October of 1878, Samuel was hired by the Historical Society of Gettysburg to photograph the interior of the old McAllister House, a 3-story brick building on Baltimore Street that had served as a Confederate field hospital during the battle. The house was being prepared for restoration, and the society wanted a complete photographic record before any work began. It seemed like a straightforward job. Samuel had done dozens like it. He had no idea what he was about to discover. The photography session took place on a cold afternoon, October 19, 1878. Samuel arrived at the McAllister house with his assistant, a young man named Thomas Brennan who helped carry equipment and prepare the glass plates. The house was empty, the owners having moved out months earlier. The rooms smelled of dust and old wood and something else, something Samuel couldn't quite identify. A kind of heaviness in the air that made breathing feel difficult. Samuel began in the main parlor, a large room on the first floor with tall windows and dark wallpaper. He set up his camera, a large format view camera that used the dry plate process, a newer technique that was gradually replacing the older wet collodion method. The dry plate process allowed for shorter exposure times and produced incredibly sharp, detailed images. It would capture everything in that room with perfect clarity. Everything, and more. As Samuel prepared the glass plate, coating it with a light-sensitive emulsion, Thomas noticed something odd about the room. The dimensions seemed wrong somehow. He paced from one wall to the other, counting his steps. 14 steps. Then he went outside and measured the exterior wall. It should have been 14 steps too. But it was 18. There were 4 feet of space that didn't exist inside the room. A gap, hidden somewhere in the walls. Samuel dismissed it as a construction quirk. Old houses were never perfectly symmetrical. But Thomas insisted something was off. They examined the walls carefully, running their hands over the plaster and wallpaper. And there, on the eastern wall, Thomas found it. A section of wall that sounded hollow when tapped. But there was no door, no visible seam, nothing to indicate an opening had ever existed. Curious now, Samuel decided to photograph that wall specifically. He positioned his camera directly facing it, adjusted the focus, prepared a fresh glass plate. The exposure would take about 8 seconds. During those 8 seconds, the camera would record not just light, but something else. Something impossible. When Samuel developed the plate later that evening in his makeshift darkroom, he stood frozen for several minutes, unable to process what he was seeing. The photograph showed the parlor wall exactly as it had appeared to his eyes. Dark wallpaper, a painting of a landscape, a small table with a vase. But in the center of the image, clear as day, was a doorway. Not a shadow, not a reflection, a doorway. And through that doorway, Samuel could see another room. A small room, maybe 8 feet square, with a simple wooden chair, a narrow bed, and what appeared to be a figure lying on that bed. Samuel's hands shook as he examined the image under a magnifying glass. The detail was extraordinary. He could see the texture of the bedclothes, the grain of the wooden chair, even what looked like a small window in the far wall of this impossible room. And the figure on the bed, it had the unmistakable shape of a human body, lying perfectly still. The next morning, Samuel returned to the McAllister house with Thomas and 2 members of the Historical Society, Dr. James Whitmore and Mr. Robert Hendricks. He showed them the photograph first, watching their faces go pale. Then he asked them to examine the wall. They did, confirming what Thomas had noticed the day before. The measurements didn't match. There was definitely space behind that wall. Space that shouldn't be there. Dr. Whitmore made a decision. They would open the wall. The Historical Society had authority over the property, and if there really was a hidden room, they needed to know what was in it. They brought tools, a hammer and pry bar, and Samuel brought his camera to document everything. They started carefully, removing wallpaper, then plaster. The work went slowly. None of them wanted to cause unnecessary damage, but all of them needed to know the truth. After 2 hours, they broke through. And the smell that came out made all of them step back, covering their mouths. It wasn't the smell of decay, not exactly. It was old air that hadn't moved in years, thick with dust and something else. When the opening was large enough, Dr. Whitmore held up a lantern and looked inside. His face went white. He stepped back without saying a word. Mr. Hendricks looked next. He had to sit down afterward, his legs suddenly unable to support him. Samuel was the third to look. And what he saw matched the photograph exactly. The room was there. The chair, the bed, the small window, now boarded up from the outside. And on the bed, wrapped in a Confederate uniform, was a skeleton. The room had been sealed from the inside. The door, they discovered, had been plastered over from the room's interior. Then the exterior wall had been finished normally. Whoever had done this had wanted to make sure this room, and whoever was in it, stayed hidden. The skeleton was examined by a local doctor. Male, approximately 25 to 30 years old at time of death, based on bone density and dental examination. The Confederate uniform was authentic, dating to 1863. And clutched in the skeleton's hand was a letter, surprisingly well preserved in the sealed environment. The letter, written in fading ink on Confederate stationery, was addressed to someone named Catherine. It read, in part, "My dearest Catherine, by the time anyone reads this, I will have been dead for many days. I am deserting, not from cowardice but from conviction. I cannot continue this war. I have seen too much death, caused too much suffering. The family who owns this house has agreed to hide me until the battle passes. But I fear I have typhoid fever. I can feel the sickness taking me. If I die here, please know I died at peace with my choice. I hope someday you will forgive me. Your devoted James." The letter was signed James Whitfield, Private, 4th Virginia Infantry. Historical records confirmed that a James Whitfield had been reported as a deserter from that regiment on July 2, 1863, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. He had never been found. Until now. But here's where this story gets truly inexplicable. Samuel's photograph had been taken on October 19, 1878. The wall wasn't opened until October 20th. How had the camera captured an image of a room that was still sealed behind solid plaster? How had it photographed furniture and a body that no one had seen for 15 years? Dr. Whitmore, a physician with a scientific background, insisted on understanding this. He contacted Professor Daniel Morton at the University of Pennsylvania, a physicist who had done research on the properties of light and photographic processes. Professor Morton traveled to Gettysburg in November 1878, bringing with him sophisticated equipment for measuring light refraction, wall density, and photographic plate sensitivity. Morton's examination was exhaustive. He tested the wall where the photograph had been taken, measuring its composition and thickness. He examined Samuel's camera and lens, looking for any optical aberration that might explain the image. He even prepared fresh photographic plates using the same emulsion batch Samuel had used. Nothing he found could explain the photograph. The wall was solid plaster over brick. There was no crack, no hole, no way for light from the hidden room to reach the camera. And even if there had been, the room had been completely dark. How could the camera capture such detailed images of objects in absolute darkness? Morton's final report, preserved in the University of Pennsylvania archives, concluded that the photograph was genuine and unexplainable by known optical or photographic principles. He wrote, "I must conclude that the camera captured not reflected light, but rather some form of residual impression left in the physical space itself. As if the room's existence had somehow marked the area, and the photographic plate was sensitive to this marking in ways human eyes are not." The story spread quickly through Gettysburg and beyond. Newspapers from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. covered it. The photograph itself became famous, widely reproduced, analyzed by photographers and scientists across the country. Some claimed it was an elaborate hoax, but no one could prove how it had been done. The hidden room was real. The body was real. The photograph's date was verified by multiple witnesses who had seen Samuel develop it the night before the wall was opened. What makes this case particularly compelling is what happened next. Samuel, curious whether this phenomenon could be repeated, began photographing other old buildings in Gettysburg, particularly those that had served as hospitals or field stations during the battle. And he found more anomalies. Not hidden rooms this time, but other things that shouldn't have been visible. In one photograph of a bedroom in a house on Chambersburg Street, he captured what appeared to be surgical instruments laid out on a table. When they examined the room in person, there was no table, no instruments. But historical records confirmed that room had been used for amputations during the battle. In another photograph, taken in the basement of a house on Washington Street, Samuel's camera captured what looked like shelves full of medicine bottles. The basement was empty when photographed, but records showed it had been used as an improvised pharmacy in July 1863. Samuel's camera was somehow seeing through time, capturing images of things that had existed 15 years earlier in spaces that still remembered them. Dr. Whitmore began documenting these cases systematically. Between 1878 and 1882, Samuel took more than 40 photographs in Gettysburg that showed historical elements not visible to the naked eye. Each photograph was verified by multiple witnesses. Each anomaly was cross-referenced with historical records. The pattern was undeniable. Somehow, in places where intense trauma had occurred, where death and suffering had been concentrated, the camera could capture residual images from the past. This research attracted national attention. The American Society for Psychical Research, founded in Boston in 1884, sent investigators to study Samuel's work. They brought their own cameras, their own plates, their own witnesses. And they replicated his results. Photographs taken in Gettysburg, particularly in buildings associated with the battle, consistently showed historical elements that existed only in the past. But here's the most unsettling part. The phenomenon seemed to be getting stronger. Photographs taken in 1880 showed clearer historical images than those from 1878. By 1883, some photographs were capturing what looked like human figures, shadowy forms that corresponded to documented casualties. It was as if the act of photographing these spaces was somehow amplifying their connection to the past, making the residual impressions more visible, more persistent. The town of Gettysburg began to attract photographers from across America, all hoping to capture similar phenomena. Most failed. The effect seemed specific to certain locations and required something more than just technical skill. Samuel believed it required a kind of sensitivity, an openness to what he called temporal resonance. Not everyone could capture these images, even using identical equipment in identical locations. This selective success became another source of controversy. Skeptics argued it proved the whole thing was fraudulent, that Samuel and a few collaborators were manipulating their results. But supporters pointed out that the successful photographers were all individuals who reported feeling strong emotional reactions to Gettysburg, who were deeply affected by the battle's history. As if the camera alone wasn't enough. It needed to be operated by someone who could feel the weight of what had happened there. Samuel Porter continued his work in Gettysburg until his death in 1891. His collection of anomalous photographs, more than 200 images, was donated to the Gettysburg Historical Society, where it remains to this day. Each photograph is carefully preserved, available for examination by researchers and skeptics alike. The original glass plate negatives still exist, allowing for modern analysis using technology Samuel could never have imagined. In the 1920s, the collection was examined using early spectroscopic analysis. Researchers found that the anomalous elements in the photographs had slightly different chemical properties than the rest of each image, suggesting they were created through a different physical process. In the 1950s, computer-enhanced analysis revealed even more detail in the historical elements, confirming their authenticity and their impossible nature. The hidden room in the McAllister house remained unsealed for several years after its discovery. Visitors could look inside, see the chair, the bed, the small boarded window. The skeleton of James Whitfield was eventually buried in the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, though there was controversy about whether a deserter should be honored that way. In the end, compassion won. He was a casualty of the war, regardless of his final choice. The room itself became something of a shrine. People would stand in the parlor, looking at the wall where the photograph had been taken, trying to reconcile the solid plaster with the image that had captured what lay behind it. Some reported feeling cold spots in that area. Others claimed to hear faint sounds, like someone breathing slowly, laboriously, as if ill. In 1893, the McAllister house was torn down to make way for new construction. The hidden room was carefully documented before demolition. Photographs, measurements, samples of the plaster and brick were preserved. Today, those artifacts are in the Gettysburg Museum, along with Samuel's original photograph and the letter found with James Whitfield's remains. The phenomenon Samuel discovered has never been satisfactorily explained. Modern physics offers some speculative theories. Quantum mechanics suggests that information might be stored in space itself, particularly in areas where significant events have occurred. Some physicists have proposed that intense trauma could create lasting impressions in the quantum field, impressions that specialized equipment might detect. But these remain theories, not explanations. What we're left with is a mystery that bridges history, physics, and human consciousness. A mystery documented by a careful photographer, verified by skeptical scientists, and preserved in images that still exist today. The photograph of the hidden room hangs in the Gettysburg Historical Society, a silent testimony to the possibility that our world is far stranger than we assume. That cameras might capture not just reflected light, but echoes of the past, impressions left by human suffering and the weight of history itself. Samuel Porter's final journal entry, written just days before his death, reads, "I have spent 13 years photographing the unseen history of this town. Every image reminds me that we live surrounded by the past, that the boundaries between then and now are far more permeable than we believe. The camera taught me that time doesn't erase, it only obscures. And sometimes, with the right tools and the right sensitivity, we can see through that obscurity to what still remains, what will always remain, in the spaces we think are empty." If you found this story as fascinating and unsettling as I did, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most unexplainable mysteries. Drop a comment and let me know what you think happened. Was Samuel's camera somehow sensitive to residual energy? Was this quantum information preserved in space? Or is there something about trauma and memory that we still don't understand? The photograph exists. The hidden room was real. The rest is for you to decide.